All right, so in this video, we're going to continue on talking about the heart, but we're going to start here with this idea of heart sounds. And I mentioned this already in previous, lectures, but we said that your heart has 4 valves, but there's only 2 heart sounds. And so the way this works is that if you have 4 valves and 2 heart sounds, that means that 2 valves are closing at the same time, right? So the way this works then is that when both of the atrioventricular valves close, that forms a heart sound which we call lub, right? That which is S1. And then when both of the semilunar valves close, that forms S2 or dub, which is the second heart sound. So that's kind of an interesting idea because if there's 4 valves, but two sounds, that means that of that group, basically, there's 2 closing at the same time. And so when you hear like abnormal heart sounds, we call that a murmur, and it can usually indicate things like incompetent valves, which are ones that don't close fully, or stenotic valves, which are ones that don't open fully. And so the reason why this can create murmurs is that instead of having a nice, clean, like loud lub sound or a dub sound, like it might be like lub or dub, right? Kind of trails off a little bit because the valve isn't closing or opening fully, so it makes an odd sound, which you can actually hear or auscultate with the stethoscope, right? And we'll be doing this in next week in lab. But some locations of auscultation here, you guys, would be for the heart between the 2nd and 5th intercostal spaces, right? So the intercostal spaces are between the ribs. So the 2nd intercostal space would be between ribs 2 and 3, and the 5th intercostal space would be between ribs 5 and 6, right? So that means it's actually kind of high up because the first rib is actually below your clavicle, and the second rib is just underneath the clavicle, right? So you see your third rib is right around here. So this is approximately the 2nd intercostal space, all the way up that high on your chest, right? Now, at the 2nd intercostal space, what you can hear then are the semilunar valves. Now, on the right side of the 2nd intercostal space, kind of just to the right of the sternum there, what you're going to hear pretty well is the aortic valve. So the aortic semilunar valve is audible, or you can hear it sort of in the 2nd intercostal space just to the right of the sternum. And then the pulmonary semilunar valve is located in the 2nd intercostal space. You can hear it in the 2nd intercostal space just to the left of the sternum, right? So next week in lab, when we're listening for these heart sounds, you guys can find that, right? So like, for instance, if you just kind of palpate where the sternum is and find approximately where your 2nd intercostal space is, because here's your clavicle, right? Just go down just below the clavicle. Right there, you should hear the aortic valve, okay? And if you move over to the left side, in the same plane, just transversely, just going straight across, you should hear the pulmonic valve, or pulmonary semilunar valve. Now, if you go down to the 5th intercostal space, down here, what you'll hear then are the atrioventricular valves. So on the right side, you're going to hear the tricuspid valve, which is the right AV valve. And on the left side, you're going to hear the mitral valve, which is the left AV valve. So that kind of makes sense. So you can actually auscultate or sort of isolate the sounds of all 4 valves. And the way this works, you guys, is that valve is going to sound louder at that point, right? But you're not going to only hear that valve amongst all the heart sounds. You're still going to hear the lub-dup, lub-dup, lub-dup. It's just that when you're in that particular area, that valve is going to sound louder amongst the lub-dub sounds, right? So what was the lub sound, or S1? Like, which valves closed during S1? The AV valve, right? So during the lub-dub, if you're trying to auscultate, and if you're down in the 5th intercostal space, these ones are going to sound louder, like a louder lub sound, right? If you're up high and you're listening up in the 2nd intercostal space, when these semilunar valves close, those ones are going to be, the dub sounds, which, those are going to be louder while you're up there. So that's kind of how you can isolate these sounds. So what we're going to move on to next, you guys, is this idea of something called the cardiac cycle. And the cardiac cycle represents all of the events that occur in one heartbeat, right? So unless your heart rate is 60 beats per minute, you're going to have actually more than one heartbeat in a second, if that makes sense, right? Or at least not a complete heartbeat in a second, or more than like 1.5 or so, right? So what we're saying to you guys is that this cardiac cycle is actually pretty fast, right? So it's all the events that occur in a heartbeat. And you can divide the cardiac cycle into 2 phases. We have systole and diastole. And that might sound kind of familiar to you guys because systolic pressure is the higher blood pressure, and diastolic pressure is the lower blood pressure, right? So systolic is a state of contraction. Diastolic is a state of relaxation. And so with the systolic blood pressure here, you guys, what we find then is that that's the pressure that's generated while your heart is currently in a state of contraction. Diastolic blood pressure while your heart's currently in a state of relaxation. Now it turns out that your heart spends 2/3 of its time in diastole and only 1/3 of the time in systole. And that kind of makes sense because you need your heart to be relaxed in order to fill with blood. So you wouldn't want to be like contracting mostly because then you're not able to fill with blood. And the heart wouldn't work well as a muscular pump if that were the case. Now kind of keep that in mind, you guys, because when we get to the next chapter on blood pressure and blood pressure regulation, we'll talk about something called mean arterial pressure. And the mean is the average, right? So usually when you think about taking an average, you just like add systolic, diastolic, or whatever, divide by 2. Right? Because you say, oh, there's these 2 things, divide by 2. That's your average, right? Well, you can't do that here because these phases aren't weighted equally, right? You spend 2/3 of your time in diastole and only 1/3 of the time in systole. So you can't just add them together and divide by 2 because they don't carry the same weight in terms of time. So there's a kind of a more complex equation for mean arterial pressure, but kind of keep that in mind, okay? So what does systole mean then? If we just say systole, what does that mean just generally? The heart's contracting, right? Now, is it contracting most of the time? No, it's most of the time it's in a state of diastole, which is rest. So the heart's actually filling with blood. So in these next slides, you guys, we're going to talk about the phases of ventricular filling, the cardiac cycle. But we're going to start with one phase here. Now, the cardiac cycle is a circle, right? And so circles don't have a beginning or an end. So you just got to pick a starting point. And so we'll just pick ventricular filling as our starting point. So if we say here, at this point, the ventricles are filling with blood. You guys think, are they in systole or diastole at this point? They must be in diastole if they're filling, right? So we see then that early in ventricular filling, the ventricles are in a state of diastole. So are the atria, actually. So the atria are actually also in diastole early on during ventricular filling, because most of the filling of your ventricles is passive. We see that 80% of the blood that fills your ventricles fills those based on gravity. So blood just kind of falls down in the ventricles, and it's not actually pumped in for 80% of that blood, right? So, but the remaining 20% of that blood is actually forced into the ventricles through atrial contraction. So we have atrial systole, which then forces that blood down in the ventricles, okay? Now, for the volume of blood that fills your ventricles, right before the ventricles contract, we call this ventricular end diastolic volume. And that kind of makes sense because the end of diastole must also be the beginning of systole. You got it, right? From all ends become a beginning, right? So if it's the end of diastole, that's right before systole. So what this term tells us then, or end diastolic volume, is how much blood has filled the ventricle right before the ventricle contracts. Now, this plays in a very important role in terms of blood pressure regulation, so make sure you guys understand this concept moving forward too, but we'll also touch back on this later today too. Okay. So what follows next then, you guys, is ventricular systole. And so just kind of ask you guys, which EKG event would correlate with ventricular systole? You guys remember? So which event in the EKG would correlate with contraction of the ventricles? The QRS wave. Very good. Nice. So the QRS wave would correlate with that, and that makes sense because you have the action potential spreading across the ventricles, and as they spread across those ventricles, the ventricles can start contracting, right? And so what we're saying then is that the beginning of ventricular systole is going to correlate with the QRS wave. Now keep that in mind too, guys, because in a little bit we'll talk about something called the Weiger diagram, where it basically shows all these cardiac cycle events in relationship to things like the EKG and heart sounds. Okay, so during ventricular systole, and the ventricles start to contract, right? What they're doing is they're forcing down on the blood that's in there. Now what happens is when you start to compress that blood, it increases pressure, right? Because compressed fluids have a pressure to them. So, and you guys may have seen this before. Like, you ever seen that where like maybe like a ball like sinks down to the bottom of the ocean, and when they retrieve that ball, it's like all shriveled up into nothing. It's like the tiniest little bit of nothing. That's because there's so much pressure that deep down in the ocean that it crushes what's ever in there, right? So it's similar thing like kind of in your heart, except for as your heart starts to squeeze on the blood starts to compress, and that compressed blood now has a pressure to it, right? Now, kind of like air, blood flows from high pressure to low pressure. So if the ventricles are contracting and your atria are relaxed, do you guys think the pressure is going to be higher in the ventricles or is it higher in the atria? Higher in the ventricles. Very good. So if it's higher in the ventricles, where does the blood want to flow? In the atria. But do we want the blood to flow backwards? No. Heck no, right? So what happens here, you guys, is that as the blood tries to flow back into your atria, the AV valves catch that and they close. So early on during ventricular systole, you're going to hear the first heart sound, which is the lub sound. That's S1, and it's due to the closure of the atrioventricular valves. Now, at this period of time, the AV valves close. Now, at the same period of time the AV valves first close, all of the valves are closed right now. And the reason why all the valves are closed is that the semilunar valves are closed because there's still higher pressure in the pulmonary trunk and aorta from the previous contraction. So we call that diastolic pressure. So the ventricles have to continue to squeeze on that blood to be able to get those semilunar valves to even open just yet. So when the AV valves first close, that begins a phase called the isovolumetric contraction phase, which you guys can see here. So isovolumetric contraction phase is when all the valves are closed because the ventricles have generated enough pressure to close the AV valves, but they haven't yet generated enough pressure to open the semilunar valves. Because on the other side of those semilunar valves, there is blood with a higher pressure still. And that pressure that's in the pulmonary trunk and aorta is higher than the ventricles because it's diastolic or residual pressure from the previous contraction. And the ventricles are just starting to contract, so they haven't generated that much force yet. Okay? So this phase is called the isovolumetric contraction phase, where all the valves are closed and the ventricles are starting to contract. Okay? Now, once the ventricles have generated enough pressure, they can squeeze down hard enough, and that causes those semilunar valves to swing open. Now, the semilunar valves will only open once there's enough pressure to overcome the residual or diastolic pressure in the aorta or pulmonary trunk. So when you guys think of like your peripheral diastolic pressure and you think about like the low number, like what's your low blood pressure number approximately? Sure, yeah, let's say 70, right? So 70 millimeters of mercury, right? So those semilunar valves won't open until there is 71 millimeters of mercury inside the ventricles, okay? But they're going from 0. So they're at rest, they're at 0 millimeters of mercury, right? Now, as they start to contract and kind of force down that blood, they have to continually increase that pressure up and up and up and up and up to 71. And then at 71, those semilunar valves will swing open because the blood's going to go from high to low pressure. Because lower pressure would be 70, high pressure would be 71, right? Now, it doesn't stop at 71. The ventricles will continue to bear down on that blood, so the pressure continues to rise even though the semilunar valves have opened, right? Now, once those semilunar valves swing open, that begins a phase called the ejection phase. Now, it's called the ejection phase because blood is now being ejected from the heart. Now, if you think about what this means, though, you guys, isovolumetric. Iso means the same. Volumetric just means volume. So isovolumetric means that there is no change in the volume of blood in your ventricles at this phase. That makes sense because all the valves are closed. And so if all the valves are closed, the blood's not going anywhere. If blood's not going anywhere, then the volume of the blood's not changing, right? The pressure can be changing, but not the volume, okay? So in ejection phase, though, those semilunar valves swing open, and all of a sudden blood gets ejected out of the heart, okay? Now this will continue until the ventricles stop contracting, okay? Now what EKG event correlates with ventricular relaxation? The T wave, very good. So when the ventricles start to relax, you see the T wave, which is ventricular repolarization, right? And now there's another value here too, guys. We call this end systolic volume, or ESV. So end systolic volume is the volume of blood that remains in your ventricle at the end of systole. So if it's the end of systole, what should come next? Diastole. Very good. Because remember, all ends have a new beginning. So if it's the end of systole, it must come next is diastole. That's the only two phases your heart can be in. It's either systole or diastole. Okay. So if it's end systolic volume, what's coming next is diastole. Okay. Now there's a volume of blood that still stays in your ventricles because your ventricles can't pump all that blood out. Okay. Now they can't pump it all out for a variety of reasons, but the reason why we want to know how much ESV there is that if you knew what your EDV was and you subtract that from your ESV, then you can figure out how much blood left the heart, right? Because EDV was how much blood filled your ventricles, and systolic volume is how much blood remains in your ventricles, and the difference between the two is how much blood was ejected, which we call stroke volume, okay? So what happens next, you guys, is as the ventricles begin to relax, so they start to relax, and they're expanding now, right? Pressure starts to fall in the ventricle. So if the ventricles are relaxing, do you guys think that there's higher or lower pressure in the ventricle or the aorta? Where's the pressure going to be higher, ventricle or aorta? If the ventricles are relaxing. In the aorta. Very good. So if the pressure is higher in the aorta and lower in the ventricle, where does the blood want to flow? Back in the ventricle. But do we want it to flow back? No. So then what happens, you guys, is that as the blood tries to flow back in the ventricle, when they start to relax, all of a sudden the semilunar valves catch that blood. And when they catch it, they close with so much force that creates a heart sound, which we call dub, which is the second heart sound. Okay, that's S2. So remember, the heart sounds are only due to the closure of these valves, not the opening of valves. Okay. Now you can hear the opening of valves because it's going to sound like a whooshing sound sometimes. But when you talk about like lub-dub, that's the closing of those valves. Okay. Now, when the ventricles relax, the atria are also relaxed at this point, you guys, and the semilunar valves close with so much force, they form something called the dicrotic notch. And the dicrotic notch is basically like, it's a wave of pressure that you can measure in your blood vessels in response to the closure of the semilunar valves. So the semilunar valves close with so much force that there's actually a pressure wave that gets transmitted across your like larger blood vessels. And you can measure that like on a blood pressure cuff, which is pretty cool. So when atrial pressure, though, exceeds ventricular pressure, AV valve will open, and basically the ventricles start to fill with blood again. But here's the thing, you guys, is that after isovolumetric relaxation phase, remember all the valves are closed at this point. So the semilunar valves are closed because the pressure is low in the ventricle, and the pressure is still high in the aorta and pulmonary trunk. The AV valves are still closed at this point, because pressure is still higher in the ventricle than the atria because they're just starting to relax. They haven't fully relaxed yet, right? Once the ventricles fully relax and the pressure gets pretty close to zero, that little bit of pressure in the atria, because there's some blood in there, it might be like 5 millimeters of mercury. Once that ventricular pressure dips down below 5, then all of a sudden those AV valves will swing open. But when the AV valves open, initially, that's not due to atrial contraction. That's totally passive, you guys. We're saying that it's just because the ventricles have relaxed below atrial pressure such that the AV valves can now swing open and that blood just falls in the ventricles. Now, it's not because of the atria contracting. Remember we said that 80% of the blood that fills your ventricles is passive flow, not active. So that's where we're seeing it right here, you guys. So we just went full circle, by the way. So now we're back at step 1. Because if you guys remember, step 1, we said that we had ventricular filling, where 80% of the filling was due to passive flow from the atria. So you might wonder, well, okay, where did that blood come from that's now filling the ventricles after the AV valves open? Well, that blood that fills the atria is actually filling it while the ventricles were contracting. So when the ventricles were contracting during ventricular systole, the atria were filling up, and they were getting ready for the next cycle, right? Because when the ventricles relax and those AV valves open up, all of a sudden that blood's already there and just falls in the ventricles, right? And that accounts for 80% of what fills the ventricle. Then the atria contract and force that 20% in, which gets you to 100% of filling, right? What should happen after that, you guys, once the ventricles are full? Isovolumetric contraction phase, that's good. But that kind of comes when the ventricles begin to contract, right? Now, it's not like the heart knows that the ventricle is full and therefore it should start to contract. The way this is coordinated, you guys, is solely on the electrical pathways we talked about last time, right? So we said that we had like our P wave, QRS wave, and our T wave. and there was an electrical conducting pathway. So remember how we said that the reason why we have a P wave there is that the action potentials begin in the atria, then they spread across the atria. So the first part of your heart to contract is the atria. It squeezes that 20% of blood in the ventricles. Then those action potentials are held at the AV node for 100 milliseconds. Then they spread down the bundle branches to the ventricles. Then the ventricles begin to contract. So what coordinates all this, you guys, is solely the electrical events of the heart. Your heart doesn't measure like, oh, hey, I got 100%, my ventricles are 100% full, time to contract. It doesn't know that. It doesn't measure that. So although the reason why I want to clarify that is that sometimes people believe that, but just kind of keep that in mind. So what this slide shows you guys is there's this thing called the Weiger diagram. And I think if you look at this, it can be kind of confusing and daunting at first because you look at this and you're like, man, there's a lot of lines, right? So what I do when I look at this, you guys, I just pick a starting point. Like you just got to pick something to reference and then work your way down, okay? So I like to start with the EKG because that's basically what gets this all going anyways, because if the EKG represents electrical events, we know that electrical events can stimulate mechanical events, right? Okay, so let's check this out, you guys. Let's start here with our P wave. So remember, the P wave represents action potentials spreading across the atria. So as action potentials are spreading across the atria, what should you expect to see with like atrial muscle? It should be contracting or depolarizing. And that's what the P wave represents, right, is depolarization. But with the depolarization, you should expect to see contraction. So if you guys look down here, on the purple line, this is atrial pressure. And you guys see that once we have our P wave, all of a sudden atrial pressure rises. That makes sense because the atria are now starting to contract, right? Now, the blue line here represents ventricular pressure. So that when the atria start to contract, and they're forcing that blood down in the ventricles, then ventricular pressure rises with that because you're basically forcing blood down, okay? So P wave, atrial pressure rises, okay? That makes sense. And you guys see that this line down here represents the volume of filling in your ventricle. So you see that all of a sudden there's a little bit that fills the ventricle even more. How much is this, by the way? Remember, 20%, you got it. So 20% of the blood that fills the ventricle is only due to atrial systole. So what does that mean for the rest of this filling back here? It's passive. It just flows in because of gravity. You got it. That's if you're sitting upright, right? If you're hanging upside down or something, like it's obviously not going to be passive, but that's a different story. So the P waves here, you guys, and then look over here. We have the QRS wave. So what did our QRS wave correlate with in terms of like activities in the heart? Yeah, QRS wave represents ventricular depolarization. So what does ventricular depolarization lead to? Ventricular contraction. Because the depolarization just represents action potentials. And so if you're having action potentials begin there, then you should expect to see contraction next, right? So just to guess, you guys, what do you think you should see then with ventricular pressure right around the QRS wave? It should rise. Let's go down. Let's see if that's the case. Let's go down here. Let's find our blue line. Here it is. Do you guys see that ventricular pressure just shoots up? Okay. So when ventricular pressure exceeds atrial pressure, what happens to the AV valves at that point? They close. So do you guys see that when this blue line crosses the purple line? Right there, when the blue line is above the purple line because ventricular pressure is above atrial pressure, the AV valves close because the blood's going to try to flow back into the atria. So what should we see in terms of heart sounds right around that point? The lub sound, which is right here. There it is, the first heart sound. You got it. Okay, so then what happens, you guys, is that when the AV valves close, all the valves are closed. What's that phase called right here when all the valves are closed and the ventricles are contracting? Isovolumetric contraction phase. Very good. So isovolumetric contraction phase. So then when ventricular pressure continues to rise, right, and it gets above aortic pressure, then those semilunar valves swing open, right? And so then once the semilunar valve swings open, then we have the ejection phase where the blood's actually able to leave the heart. But you guys see that ventricular pressure continues to rise even though blood's leaving because the ventricles are still contracting, right? So this is the peak of systolic pressure here. And then all of a sudden, the ventricular pressure begins to fall because the ventricles are starting to relax. So which EKG event correlates with ventricular relaxation? T wave. There it is. There's our T wave on the EKG as the ventricles are relaxing. Now, what happens when ventricular pressure gets below aortic pressure? The semilunar valves close, right? Because then the blood tries to flow back from the aorta back in the ventricle where the pressure is lower. But the semilunar valves prevent that and they snap shut, right? So when the semilunar valves close, what heart sound is that? Dub sound, and there it is, the second heart sound, right? Because remember I said though that when the semilunar valves close, they close with so much force that it creates a measurable blip in pressure, and here it is. This is called the dicrotic notch. So all of a sudden the pressure in your aorta zooms up again because when those semilunar valves snap shut, that actually creates a pressure wave that's transmitted across your blood vessels. And you guys can see that right here. This is called the dicrotic notch. That's due to the closure of the semilunar valve. Okay. Now, when those semilunar valves close and all the valves are closed at this point, what phase do we call this while the ventricles are relaxing? So all the valves are closed at this point and the ventricles are relaxing. Good. Isovolumetric relaxation phase. Okay. So isovolumetric relaxation phase. Very good. And so as the ventricles continue to relax and ventricular pressure gets below atrial pressure, do you guys see how it's getting pretty low here? Right when ventricular pressure gets below atrial pressure and the pressure is now higher in the atria and lower in the ventricles, what happens to those AV valves? They swing open. Good. And they swing open right here when it dips below the atrial pressure. So what should we expect to see then when those AV valves open in terms of ventricular volume? Yeah, ventricular volume should shoot up. And we see that right here. Do you guys see this? So all of a sudden ventricular volume starts to rise quite a bit. But all this filling right here, you guys, is this passive or active? Totally passive. Do you guys see that there's no contraction going on here? There's no rises of pressure. I mean, there is some slight rise in pressure because of the filling that's going on, right? But the ventricles and atria aren't contracting at this point. So this is all passive filling. And then guess what? We're full circle again because there's another P wave right there. Okay? So basically that's one cardiac cycle, you guys. From P wave to P wave, that's all the events that occur in one heartbeat. Okay? So kind of keep this in mind, you guys. And you want to know approximately what's kind of going on across these events. Because on the exam, what I'll have is a Weiger diagram like this. And I'll circle areas like what happens here, or what happens here, or here, right? And you got to be able to tell me what's going on at those points. So if you know this Weiger diagram, then you know the heart, because this is basically all the events together, right? You got your EKG, you got your heart sounds, you got your pressures, you got your volumes, and then you have your zones too, like isovolumetric contraction phase, ejection phase, and isovolumetric relaxation phase. So what's all this kind of light blue area, you guys? What phase do y'all think that is? The light blue. Ventricular. Well, kind of like ventricular filling. That's good. But ventricles are filling during diastole. You got it. So all of this is diastole. And that kind of makes sense because there's more light blue than any of the shaded region, right? And because the ventricles spend more time in diastole than systole. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay. All right, guys, cool. So we want to talk about this idea of cardiac output as well. So CO, or cardiac output, I know it has the kind of the same letters as carbon monoxide, but cardiac output is a pretty important concept as well, you guys. And we're actually going to come back to this a lot next week as well, because cardiac output directly correlates with blood pressure. So if you increase cardiac output, you're going to increase blood pressure. If you decrease cardiac output, you decrease blood pressure. So what is cardiac output? Well, based on the name, it sounds like something to do with blood flow out of the heart, right? And so cardiac output translates to the volume of blood that your heart pumps out in 1 minute. And the way you calculate this is heart rate times stroke volume. So heart rate is beats per minute. Stroke volume is volume per beat. And the way you calculate stroke volume is EDV minus ESV. So the amount of blood that filled the ventricle minus the amount of blood that remains in the ventricle equals the amount of blood that your ventricles pumped out. That's your stroke volume. So if you take the number of heartbeats in a minute, multiply that by blood per beat, you get blood per minute, which is cardiac output. So it turns out, you guys, that your cardiac output at rest is right around 5 liters of blood. So what's your blood volume? What's your total blood volume in your body? You guys don't remember? Yeah, very good. 4 to 5, 5 to 6, right around there, right around 5. So what this is saying right here, you guys, is 5 liters of blood, which is pretty much your entire blood volume in 1 minute. Your heart can pump out at rest. So at rest, your heart pumps your entire blood volume in 1 minute, which is pretty phenomenal. I know, it's crazy. So that's cardiac output. Now, at rest, 5¼ liters or so. That's with these variables. Now, these variables can obviously change because your heart rate could be faster and your stroke volume can even be greater. And we'll talk about the things that can alter these particular variables too. Now, cardiac output can increase if either the heart rate or stroke volume increase. Maximal cardiac output, you guys, is usually about 4 to 5 times resting cardiac output. So that we're saying that in a non-trained athlete, right, you can pump out about 20 liters or so in a minute during exercise. That's a lot, right? This is my 1 liter water bottle, okay? Your heart can pump out 20 of these in a minute during exercise, which ends up being 4 to 5 times your entire blood volume, which is pretty phenomenal, I know. So maximal cardiac output, you guys, in trained athletes ends up being 35 liters. If you're trained in a professional athlete, like a bicyclist or a swimmer or something, you can pump out 35 of these water bottles in 1 minute, which is 7 times your entire blood volume. So you're circulating your blood volume 7 times through your body in 1 minute during exercise. That's crazy. That's a lot of blood, right? So this idea of cardiac reserve is actually the difference between resting and maximal cardiac output. And so to know cardiac reserve gives you an idea of heart health, because your cardiac reserve should be pretty high. You should have a pretty good difference between resting cardiac output and maximal cardiac output. If they're not very different, if your maximal cardiac output is pretty similar to rest, that means your heart's pretty inefficient. It's not able to keep up with exercise, right? So you want to have a high cardiac reserve. So that's kind of what they're looking for, stress tests and that kind of stuff. You guys, if you have a heart attack and you go get stress tests, they're looking at things like cardiac reserve, because it gives you an idea of how efficient your heart can be during exercise. Okay, so for stroke volume, remember we said that stroke volume was EDV minus ESV, and that kind of makes sense, because remember, cardiac output, I'll use the whiteboard here, so cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume, right? So stroke volume, though, is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume, so EDV minus ESV. And so we were saying then that EDV is the amount of blood that fills your ventricle right before it contracts, and ESV is the amount of blood that remains in your ventricle after it contracts. So the difference between the two is this, which is effectively how much blood was pumped out. That's stroke volume. So stroke volume is the amount of blood your heart pumps out in 1 beat. And so it turns out, you guys, that there's a variety of things that can affect stroke volume. And so there's actually 3 major factors here. We have preload, contractility, and afterload. But before we move forward, you guys, let's make sure we have this down. What's end diastolic volume? What does that mean? Blood that fills the ventricle. Very good. And what about end systolic volume? Blood that remains in the ventricle. Very good. Awesome. Okay. So that can change, though, because you can have more blood fill the ventricle or less blood fill the ventricle, right? Or you can have more blood left behind or less blood left behind. But just thinking about this equation, you guys, what are a variety of ways you can increase your stroke volume or increase the amount of blood your heart pumps out? Just looking at the equation, how could you get a bigger SV? If you wanted to increase stroke volume, what could you do to this equation to make SV a bigger number? What would you do to EDV? Would you make EDV a bigger number or a smaller number? Yeah, definitely bigger, right? Let's think about this in terms of a math equation. If it's 10 minus 2 and you get 8 here, What if we wanted a bigger number than 8? What could you do to this number instead of having a 10? Make that 12, right? This 12 minus 2 is 10. So then your answer is larger. Okay. So what we can do then is to increase stroke volume. You can increase end diastolic volume. Okay. And so end diastolic volume, if you increases, it generally increases stroke volume. What could you do to end systolic volume? Caitlin, tell us. If you want to increase stroke volume, what could you do to end systolic volume? Decrease it, exactly. If you make ESV a smaller number, SV is a bigger number. Okay, so the next question for you guys then is, how could you get a smaller end systolic volume? Like, how could you have less blood left in the heart? What could your heart do to have less blood left behind? Contract more strongly. You got it. Good. So if you increase heart muscle contractility, then you have a smaller ESV. Okay. So now we're going to do, guys, is move on and talk about these 3 factors, and it kind of just relates to what we just talked about. So we have preload, contractility, and afterload, right? So these 3 factors here affect stroke volume, guys. And by the way, this comes up a lot next week. So make sure you guys have these ones down, because when we talk about blood pressure regulation, these come up a lot. So preload is the degree of stretch on cardiac muscle. Now that stretch is going to be due to the filling of blood within the ventricle. So basically what we can say then, you guys, is preload is EDV. So if your EDV is high, your preload's high. Okay? Because basically if you have a larger end diastolic volume, there's larger or more stretch on the ventricle because it's filling that ventricle. Okay? Now there's a relationship here called the Frank-Starling mechanism. And the Frank-Starling mechanism basically tells us that if your ventricle stretches, it can contract more strongly. Okay? And this works because of a phenomenon, maybe you guys went over in AMP1, and it was this length-tension relationship of sarcomeres. So if you guys remember looking at the sarcomere graph, we said that, when the thick and thin filaments overlap, there's like optimal overlap for tension to be able to be created, right? So let's say if this arm is my thick filament and this arm is my thin filament. Remember, the thick filaments have your myosin heads attached, and your thin filaments are the ones that basically are, have the active sites on actin for the myosin heads to bind to, right? Now, if my muscle is like overstretched and they're not really overlapping that well, what's going to happen then is that your myosin heads don't have a lot to grab onto because it's like way over here, right? So what we're going to find then is that there's an optimal amount of stretch. So the more and more you stretch that muscle, if you overlap the thick and thin filaments optimally, then you're going to have the myosin heads are going to have more places to bind to. They're going to produce a stronger contraction. And that was generally true. But if you overstretch those sarcomeres such that the myosin heads don't have as much actin to bind to, then they won't be able to produce that much force. And so that was this idea of a length-tension relationship of sarcomeres. Now that also relates to this Frank-Starling mechanism, where if you stretch the heart muscle, it will generally contract more strongly and therefore pump out more blood by decreasing your ESV. Okay? So the way you get a bigger preload then is through venous return. So it turns out, you guys, that venous return to the heart works pretty much the same way as lymphatic return. So can you guys tell me a couple different ways that lymph was returned back to the bloodstream? So how was lymph returned back to blood? Yeah, so pulsation of nearby arteries. Okay, but what were the 2 big ones, though? Like, what were the 2 major mechanisms for lymph transport? We had a respiratory pump. So remember, when you take a deep breath, it can like draw lymph towards the heart because there's low pressure in the thorax. Same thing with venous blood, you guys. If you take a deep breath, venous blood gets drawn up towards your heart. And then what's the other one, too? So there's respiratory pump and the skeletal muscle pump. Very good. Nice. So respiratory pump and skeletal muscle pump, because your skeletal muscles can squeeze on those veins and force that blood back towards your heart. Just like lymph. You can squeeze on lymphatic vessels and force the lymph back up towards your heart, generally. Okay. So to increase venous return would mean that you're breathing heavily and using your muscles. So what are you doing if you're having more venous return to your heart? Exercising. You got it. So just exercising in and of itself returns blood back to the heart even faster. Now, if the blood returns back to your heart faster, you're going to get more filling. If you have more filling of blood, that means you have a bigger EDV. If your EDV is bigger, then you have more preload. If your preload's larger, it generally means your heart muscle is going to contract more strongly. So let's check this out on this slide here, guys. So what this relationship shows then is ventricular and diastolic volume and stroke volume, okay? So if you increase ventricular and diastolic volume, generally you're going to see that there's more blood pumped out of the heart. And that's what you can see here with this tendency of this graph here, is that the more filling you get in the ventricles, the higher the stroke volume. And that's generally true. And that's true up to a point, up till about 300 milliliters or so, okay? After 300 milliliters, you get diminishing returns on stroke volume. And the reason being, you guys, is that your heart muscle can be overstretched. So overstretch of the heart muscle goes back to that length-tension relationship we talked about, because if the sarcomeres are overstretched to the point where the myosin heads don't have as much to grab onto, because the thin filaments are way off to the side, that means they're not going to be able to produce as much force, which means you can't contract as strongly to pump that blood out, right? And so this is mostly where we operate, though, you guys, is in this region, okay? Unless you're having some odd circumstance like congestive heart failure or, you know, like really intense venous return back to your heart, because maybe you're hanging upside down or something, you know, you're not going to really reach this area under normal circumstances. So generally what we can say then is if you increase venous return to the heart, that's going to increase stroke volume. And if you increase stroke volume, what does that do to cardiac output? If you make stroke volume bigger, cardiac output is going to be greater. You got it. Very good. So generally, if you have an increase in venous return, you're going to have an increase in cardiac output. Okay. So the next one here, you guys, is this idea of contractility. And contractility refers to the contractile strength of muscle. So we're saying that if your heart muscle contracts more strongly, then it's going to be able to pump more blood out. Now, contractility affects ESV, right? So if you have a stronger contractility, then your ESV is going to be smaller because you'll have less blood left behind. If your heart muscle contractility is weaker, then your ESV is going to be larger, which means your stroke volume is going to be smaller and your cardiac output is going to be smaller, right? Okay, so our next question in here is, okay, what are the factors that can change heart muscle contractility, or like how strongly the heart muscle can contract, right? So it's increased by, first of all, your sympathetic nervous system. And we know this because your sympathetic nervous system is for fight or flight. And so the sympathetic stimulation then causes, you know, like calcium release from the SR, and you're able to get more cross bridges, so you get a stronger contraction as a result, okay? Now, it's also increased by what are called positive inotropic agents. So an inotropic agent is something that changes contractility of your heart. If it's a positive inotrope, that means your heart muscle contracts more strongly. If it's a negative inotrope, it makes your heart muscle contract more weakly, okay? So some positive inotropes are things like thyroxine, which is thyroid hormone, glucagon, epinephrine, and then a drug called digitalis, which you guys may have heard of before. Digitalis comes from a plant called foxglove. It's a flower. People grow it in their gardens, even here around town. And you can harvest this drug from that flower, and this drug increases heart muscle contractility. In fact, people have been using this flower for heart failure for thousands of years. It's kind of interesting. Now, what we've done though now is like we can like kind of isolate that drug from the flower, standardize its dose, and then give people pills. If you just chew on a random plant, like you don't know what the dose is going to be, so it could be really high or really low. That's the problem with doing these sort of like plant-based therapies, is that you don't know what the dose could be. It totally depends on how that plant grew, right? If it was healthy while it was growing, it might have more of this drug in it than than other circumstances, or vice versa. So it's just hard to know. So, anyways, also high extracellular calcium is also a positive inotropic agent, you guys. So what if you had hyperthyroidism, where your thyroxine levels were really high? What would that do to your heart, do you guys think? It would increase heart muscle contractility, right? If you increase contractility, what does that do to stroke volume? Increases stroke volume by decreasing ESV. And so if you increase stroke volume, what does it do to cardiac output? Increases it. So, and we said that cardiac output correlates with blood pressure. So if you increase blood pressure, if you increase cardiac output, you increase blood pressure. So what do you guys think then is the blood pressure in people with hyperthyroidism? Is it high or low? It's high. You got it. Very good. So people with hyperthyroidism typically suffer from hypertension because thyroxine is a positive inotropic agent. Now the glucagon and epinephrine ones make sense because these ones are released during the stress response, and it makes sense that you want to have like more contractility while you're stressed, okay, to keep your blood pressure and blood flow up. So we also have negative inotropic agents as well, you guys. So the negative inotropic agents do the opposite, and that would be things like acidosis, whether it's like lactic acidosis or respiratory acidosis. If your blood's too acidic, your heart will actually contract more weakly. So if you have respiratory failure, it turns out your heart is going to actually start to slow down and contract even more weakly. That's kind of what can accelerate this sort of decline in your health status. Now, also we find, you guys, is that an increase in extracellular potassium can also make your heart contract more weakly. This is one of the components of assisted suicide, right? When they talk about like doing, what do you call that? Like or lethal injection, you know what I mean? So like one of the components of lethal injection is basically potassium chloride. And so if you inject someone with a lot of potassium, what that does to their heart is it makes their heart contract more weakly or not at all. So then that kind of makes sense in terms of like, dying, because then if your heart doesn't contract, you stop pumping blood, you lose consciousness, and eventually all your organ systems shut down. Okay. So now with calcium channel blockers though, what those do, you guys, is they actually shorten the plateau of your cardiac action potential. So you guys remember the cardiac action potential, we had that rising or depolarization phase. We had a plateau phase due to the voltage-gated calcium channels, and then a repolarization phase due to voltage-gated potassium. Calcium channel blockers make that plateau shorter, which makes the whole action potential shorter, which means you have a briefer contraction, which means you can't produce as much force if the heart muscle contraction is shorter. That's why calcium channel blockers prevent heart muscle contractility. When would you want to give someone a calcium channel blocker? Wouldn't that make sense? Yeah, if they have high blood pressure. Very good. So if they have hypertension, then calcium channel blockers could help with that. Awesome. Very good. So the way this works here, you guys, in terms of inotropic agents, for one, let's just talk about like your sympathetic nervous system. So if you guys remember going back to AMP1, we said that your sympathetic nervous system can kind of excite organs and tissues through two different mechanisms. For one, you can release epinephrine from your adrenal medulla, and that's a hormone that travels through your bloodstream and goes to all your organ systems. Then two, we can get the release of norepinephrine from nerve terminals. So sympathetic nerve terminals release norepinephrine, and norepinephrine is also called noradrenaline, but that can bind to beta-1 adrenergic receptors in the heart. So beta-1 receptors are the ones that your heart has that can regulate sort of heart rate and contractility. That's what your sympathetic nervous system can stimulate. And so these beta-1 adrenergic receptors are G-protein coupled receptors, which means once norepinephrine binds to its receptor, it activates a G-protein, which then shuttles on over to an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. And then adenylate cyclase is an enzyme that can catalyze ATP into cyclic ANP, right? And so cyclic ANP is a signaling molecule that can phosphorylate proteins like protein kinases, and it can activate these protein kinases. Now, what protein kinases do is they add phosphate groups onto other proteins. So once you activate these protein kinases, they can change the activity of proteins inside your cell. So for instance, what happens in response to norepinephrine is you get the activation of a protein kinase that makes the calcium channels in your SR more leaky. So by having more leaky calcium channels, you get a bigger efflux of calcium into the muscle cell, and by having a bigger wave of calcium, you get a stronger contraction, right? Now these protein kinases also make the calcium pumps in your SR faster. So not only do you release more calcium with each action potential, so it kind of this huge wave of calcium that rushes out, causes a really strong contraction, but you also pump that calcium back into SR even more quickly. So you get faster contractions. So either faster and stronger contractions. So what makes them stronger is you get more calcium coming out of the SR because protein kinases can make this more leaky. And that's in response to norepinephrine, which is a sympathetic hormone or neurotransmitter. And they also makes them faster contractions because you can pump that calcium back into the SR even more quickly. And so basically what you're seeing, guys, is the molecular properties of how these hormones work on the heart. Now this is important to note because a lot of drugs target these pathways. So if you're talking about drugs that affect heart rate or heart muscle contractility, it probably has something to do with what's on this slide. Like a calcium channel blocker, well, that's going to block the voltage-gated calcium channels in the SR. So it's going to block this effect, right? What if you gave someone a beta blocker, like propranolol, where it blocked this beta-1 adrenergic receptor? So if you block the receptor, would you get this sort of effect in here? No, good. So if you don't get the response, and you don't get as much calcium leaking out of your SR from these voltage-gated calcium channels because you blocked the receptor, so what would happen to heart muscle strength or contractility from a beta blocker? It would be decreased. Very good. What about heart rate? Also decrease. Awesome. Very good. Nice. Okay, so we also talked about how there's this idea of afterload. And so afterload is the pressure that your ventricles have to overcome to force the blood out. So if you guys remember, while the ventricles started to contract, so at the beginning of ventricular contraction or systole, the ventricles are contracting, those AV valves close, but what about the semilunar valves nearby? Are those semilunar valves open or closed at this point? They're still closed. So why were the semilunar valves still closed at the beginning of ventricular systole? You guys remember? Say it again, Brittany. I can't hear, I'm sorry. Well, that's true. From the previous contraction, the semilunar valves were closed because you don't want the backflow of blood, right? But let's say if the heart's just first starting to contract and the AV valves close, right? But at this point, as the ventricles are still starting to contract, the semilunar valves are still closed. Why don't they just open up right away? Not enough pressure where? In the ventricle. Very good. So the ventricles haven't generated enough pressure to get those semilunar valves to even swing open. So what's the pressure on the opposite side of the semilunar valves? What is that? Like in the pressure in the aorta or pulmonary trunk that it's trying to overcome? You guys know? It's diastolic pressure. So it's the residual pressure from the previous contraction. And that diastolic pressure could be something like you said earlier, like 70 millimeters of mercury, right? But what if your diastolic pressure was like 100 or 120? So you know how it should, like your diastolic pressure should be a low number? What if your diastolic pressure was really high, right? Well, that would relate to something we call afterload. So afterload is the pressure, residual pressure, your heart has to overcome to be able to eject blood from the heart. So if your afterload was really high, let's say if your diastolic pressure was like 100 or 120, that means your ventricles have to generate even more pressure just to get those semilunar valves to even open, to be able to eject that blood. So that's going to put a lot of extra work on your heart to be able to eject blood. So what do you guys think an increase in afterload does to your ESV? So if your afterload were really high, so it took a lot of pressure to try to get that blood to leave the heart, and it took longer for those semilunar valves to open, what would that do to your end systolic volume generally? You might think, because you'd think, okay, well, the ventricles are having to contract more strongly to force that blood out, right? But it turns out, you guys, that afterload increases ESV because those valves stay closed longer, which means your ejection phase is really brief. Because if your ventricles have to spend more time just trying to get the semilunar valves to swing open, that means those semilunar valves are only open for a shorter period of time. If they're open for a shorter period of time, your ejection phase is shorter. And if your ejection phase is shorter, you have more blood left over in your ventricle. So if you increase ESV, what does that do to your stroke volume? Decreases stroke volume. If you decrease stroke volume, what does it do to your cardiac output? Decreases it. So here's the crazy thing, you guys, is that if you have a high diastolic pressure, first of all, it puts a lot of extra work on your heart. And secondly, you actually get poor blood flow because your heart has to work harder to overcome that residual pressure. And so we call that afterload. So here's the weird thing then is we want to make sure that our afterload is, low enough for your heart to be able to, force blood out. However, you still need diastolic pressure in your blood vessels for blood to even flow. So there's this weird balance of having some afterload but not too much. And we'll come back to this next week when we talk about blood pressure regulation. Okay? So just to summarize these factors that affect stroke volume, guys, what were the 3 factors that affect stroke volume? Preload? Yeah, good. Preload, contractility, and afterload. Of those 3, which one's due to filling? Filling of the ventricle. Preload, very good. Which one is due to diastolic pressure that your heart has to overcome? After load, good. And then which one's due to muscle strength? Contractility, very good. Okay, make sure you guys have those down before next week for real. Like, those are all going to come back again. Okay. All right, guys. So in terms of regulating your heart rate, we have our autonomic nervous system. So we said that both your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems can alter heart rate. And so we said that your parasympathetic nervous system can oppose sympathetic effects by releasing acetylcholine. Now, what acetylcholine does is it hyperpolarizes the pacemaker potential, which means that it takes longer for the pacemaker potentials to get to threshold, which means your heart rate is slower. That's how that works. And so what happens, you guys, is at rest, you have something called vagal tone. So your vagus nerves exert like a baseline amount of activity on your heart rate. So what's your resting heart rate? You guys know? Like in yourselves? Like just in you, what's your resting heart rate? Yeah, like 75? Did someone say 60? Nice. I'm impressed. That's pretty good. Because like if you're a trained athlete, like your resting heart rate could be much lower, right? So now, what's the intrinsic firing rate of your SA node, though? 100. Very good. So if your resting heart rate is slower than 100, that means that it's not because your SA node is necessarily firing like slower due to its intrinsic properties. It's that your parasympathetic nervous system is slowing the SA node firing rate down, and that's due to something called vagal tone. So your vagus nerves kind of dominate the influence of your heart at rest, which makes sense because the vagus nerves are parasympathetic, and parasympathetic is rest and digest. That's why your resting heart rate is slower than 100. So there's also an interesting reflex here too, guys. It's called the atrial or Bainbridge reflex. And the atrial Bainbridge reflex is basically where if you have more blood coming back to the heart and your atria stretch of the atria causes your SA node to fire more rapidly. But that actually makes a lot of sense because if there was more blood flowing back to your heart and your atria were stretching as a result, like you want your heart to beat more quickly to get that blood moving, like to move it along, right? To speed it up. Think of it like this, you guys. Let's say if you were like, collecting tickets at a carnival, why not? What the hell? And, like for entry tickets. And let's say that all of a sudden, like there's a big old line of people building up. How do you move that line along faster? You just collect their tickets faster, right? So this is kind of what your heart does, is that if you have a big old line of blood, like your atria are stretching, what your heart does then is it just starts beating faster. And so it can move that blood along, right? Now, to beat faster in response to stretch is called the atrial or Bainbridge reflex, and it's a reflex that occurs within the heart itself. So if you have an increase in venous return to your heart, automatically your heart rate's going to go up. I think this would be a really cool thing to test in lab. Like if we have one of those Trendelenburg tables where you can kind of lean back and just have the blood flow back to your heart passively, what you should see then is your heart muscle should stretch, and as a result, your heart rate should increase. So that makes sense. There's another reflex, which we're not going to go over here, you guys. I think maybe we'll talk about in blood pressure regulation. But there's one called the mammalian dive reflex. And that's where if you splash cold water on your face, your heart rate actually slows down. And the idea is that, like, if your face gets cold, you're probably underwater, right? Because it's a kind of cold fluid. And so then your heart rate slows down to conserve your body's oxygen while you're diving underwater. It's called the mammalian dive reflex, and this is true across mammals, even whales, because whales are mammals too, right? So this works for them too. As they go down deeper and deeper in colder and colder ocean water, their heart rates slow down. That way whales can stay down for some whales for hours. They can stay underwater. They can hold their breath for basically hours, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. All right, so what we're going to wrap up here with you guys is some ideas of ways you can increase cardiac output. Now, ultimately, what this slide shows then is basically just the equations we talked about. So going back to our equations, you guys, how do we calculate cardiac output? Well, it's heart rate times stroke volume. So if you wanted to increase cardiac output, what would you want to do to heart rate? Increase it. And what would you want to do to stroke volume? Increase it. Very good. So to increase heart rate then would be more like a sympathetic nervous system stimulation. So you increase sympathetic activity and decrease parasympathetic activity, which increases heart rate and therefore increases cardiac output. And then what about stroke volume? Well, for stroke volume, we have a decrease in ESV, which is due to an increase in contractility, And that could be from positive inotropic agents like thyroxine, calcium, and epinephrine, digitalis too. Or you can increase EDV, which is preload or stretch in your heart, right? So if you guys remember, we said that you get more filling of your heart if you get more venous return. And venous return was influenced by your respiratory pump and skeletal muscle pump. So if you're moving your body and breathing heavily, you're going to get more venous return, which means you're going to have a higher EDV. A higher EDV increases stroke volume. If you increase stroke volume, you increase cardiac output. So you guys remember, what was your resting cardiac output approximately? It was like about your blood volume or so, right? Which was like 5 liters. What about during exercise? Like let's say if you're sprinting or something. You guys remember what it can get up to? Yeah, like if you're a trained athlete, like 35 liters a minute. You know, for normal people, 4 to 5 liters a minute or so. Okay. So it's kind of amazing. One day I want to put a picture of me on here and see if anybody notices. Like, you know, like first of all, she looks really excited about running. Personally, like if I'm running, I'm like, damn, I feel like I'm gonna die because I've got exercise-induced asthma, you know, and I would not look this happy. I would be like, I'm gonna die. So in terms of chemical regulation of heart rate, you guys, we have different hormones like epinephrine and thyroxine. We talked about that. Remember, epinephrine comes from your adrenal medulla. It's a hormone that can also bind with beta-1 receptors and also increases contractility and heart rate. Thyroxine, again, also increases heart rate and contractility. Also, we'll talk about electrolyte imbalances too, you guys. So some different types of electrolyte imbalances that can affect your heart would be things like hypo and hypercalcemia, or hyperkalemia and hypokalemia. So hypocalcemia means low blood calcium that depresses your heart rate generally. Now hypercalcemia means high blood calcium, and that can increase your heart rate. And we talked about that because we said that high blood calcium was a positive inotropic agent, right? Now hyperkalemia can lead to things like heart block and cardiac arrest, and hypokalemia, which means low blood potassium, leads to things like arrhythmias. So we'll have a whole chapter on electrolyte imbalances later, you guys, like once we start talking about the kidneys. But for now, just kind of keep this stuff in mind, that you have to maintain normal electrolyte imbalance, or sorry, you have to maintain normal electrolyte balance to maintain normal heart rate and that kind of stuff. We'll come back to that later. So just to define some terms, you guys, we have tachycardia and bradycardia. Now, if your heart rate's faster than 100 beats per minute, then we call that tachycardia. And the reason being is that if your SA node intrinsically fires at 100 beats per minute, to be faster than what the SA node intrinsically fires at is faster than normal. So we say that that's tachycardia, right? Now, bradycardia is a heart rate that's slower than 60 beats per minute. And this is because it's slower than basically what the AV nodes would typically fire at, right? And so now bradycardia can become a problem if you're not a trained athlete and your heart rate's too slow. That means your cardiac output could be low. And if your cardiac output's too low to like supply your body's tissues with enough oxygen and nutrients, then your organ systems start shutting down, right? Now, sometimes though, bradycardia you can find in trained athletes where their resting heart rates are naturally less than 60, right? Like in some athletes, they can have heart rates in the 40s. Because what happens is that even though their heart rate is low, if their hearts are really strong and their stroke volume's high, they can have the same cardiac output even with a slower heart rate because their stroke volumes can be really high. And that makes sense. So in terms of congestive heart failure, you guys, we say that it's basically this progressive condition where cardiac output is too low to support your body's metabolic needs. And so it usually reflects like a weakened myocardium, which can be caused by a variety of different disorders. Now, we'll talk about these disorders and diseases in pathophysiology, but kind of keep this in mind in terms of like the causes of congestive heart failure could be things like coronary atherosclerosis, which are plaques, persistent high blood pressure, which would be high afterload that can lead to congestive heart failure, myocardial infarct, which is basically ischemia of the heart muscle, as well as dilated cardiomyopathy, which is basically like floppy heart, and that comes from a variety of conditions, one of which includes exposure to toxins. So in terms of congestion of blood, you guys, we talk about right-sided versus left-sided heart failure. Now, we talked about earlier how the right side of your heart receives blood from your systemic veins, and the left side of your heart receives blood from your pulmonary veins. So if the right side of your heart were failing, blood would back up into the systemic veins. And that's characteristic of right-sided heart failure. So what that's going to look like then is like venous distension. So you might see that their jugular veins are kind of popping out, and they might have peripheral edema all over, right? Or like swelling in their tissues. Now, left-sided heart failure leads to a backup of blood in the lungs. And so what that can lead to then is, first of all, pulmonary congestion, like pulmonary hypertension. That can also lead to pulmonary edema, which is basically fluid buildup in the lungs, where they can start to like cough up like frothy, kind of bloody sputum, because basically the pressure is so high in the blood vessels of their lungs, blood and fluid starts leaking into their airways. That's pretty terrible. So basically, guys, we'll learn later too in pathophysiology that the failure of one leads to the failure of the other. And that kind of makes sense because let's say if the left side of your heart were failing and blood's backing up in the lungs, well, that's going to put a lot of extra stress or afterload on the right side of your heart to overcome that pressure. So left side of heart failure will progress into right side of heart failure and vice versa. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. And then, it can be treated by, removing excess fluid, making sure that the pressures are low, and just ensuring adequate circulation. So again, we'll come back to this more so in pathophysiology.